Nancy Cook, who is Professor of English, Professor Emerita of English at the University of Montana, and a past president of the Western Literature Association. She has published internationally in Western American Studies and Eco-Criticism. Currently, she's at work on a collection of essays on women and Glacier National Park in Montana. So, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be back here. A brief epigraph. For history is a pontoon bridge. Every man walks and works at its building end, and he has come as far as he has over the pontoons laid by others he may never have heard of. Wallace Stegner from Wolf Willow. In the latest iteration of the U.S.'s obsession with its national borders, attention centers on the border with Mexico. And depending on one's political affiliation, Americans view the Mexican border as a last line of defense against an invasion of freeloaders, or as the site of a humanitarian crisis, or as a symbol of deep problems within America's founding principles, or some combination of these positions. The border with Mexico has been rendered visible by a wall, by armed guards, and by an abundance of surveillance equipment. For those who fear the humans who attempt to cross, these would-be immigrants have been configured as irreconcilably different from Americans, and while supposedly inferior, they are viewed as a deep threat. In the current national imaginary, U.S. borders, particularly the southern border, are seen as in need of defense against foreigners, but rarely do we see attention to the border as a containment boundary to keep Americans in the U.S., and rarely do we register concern about the U.S. border with Canada. In a 1992 documentary film, The Invisible Border, the filmmakers both assert and deny differences suggested by and created by a national boundary. They claim, quote, "The boundary between the U.S. and Canada is typically human creation, physically invisible, geographically illogical, militarily indefensible," too bad Trump didn't read that, "and emotionally inescapable," end quote. While the documentary filmmakers struggled to visualize national differences, nevertheless, they assert that national differences in healthcare, immigration policy, education, as well as the lives, status, and sovereignty of indigenous peoples and nations. The camera discerns no difference, while the voiceover narration asserts it. The invisible border reveals the difficulties that visual media have with the 49th parallel along the western portion anyway. Today, I'd like to play a little with the relationship between the first quality mentioned earlier, physically invisible, and the last, emotionally inescapable, to tease out a few ways this northern U.S. border has figured in text by writers in the U.S. West. Writers, not bound by the documentarian's task, I suggest, use altogether different tools to foreground national difference. In the 20th century and into the 21st, Americans, when they imagined escaping the U.S., often thought of heading south to Mexico. One thinks of such films as The Wild Bunch and Thelma and Louise, with Mexico as imagined as a kind of fugitive's paradise because of its allegedly corrupt police force and indifference to U.S. authority. During the Vietnam War, Canada was known for harboring draft resistors, but with its image of law and order, Canada seemed hardly the place for the Wild Bunch. After all, in Western lore, the Mounties always get their man. In several Western stories, both novels and films, characters might make forays into Canada for criminal purposes, as in the Missouri Breaks and Legends of the Fall, but they return to the U.S. to count their ill-gotten gains and to spend it. So while Mexico has figured as a place that harbors the lawless, embezzlers, thieves, and murderers, Canada has largely remained a nation of polite, law-abiding citizens in the American imagination. While running northward hasn't captured 20th and 21st century American imaginations the way Mexico has, nevertheless, a number of texts consider flight across the U.S.-Canadian border. Today, I'll look briefly at a few of those, beginning with James Welch's Winter in the Blood and ending with Richard Ford's 2012 novel, Canada. What does escape to Canada signify in these texts? First, I need to complicate what I just said a little bit. During the 19th century, Canada provided sanctuary at the northern end of the Underground Railroad and later provisionally safer spaces for Native peoples in western lands north of what was called the Medicine Line. But as Beth Liddell points out in her 2001 book, The Medicine Line, the Canadian government supported settler colonialism, and their responses to Native and First Nations people differed in practice, but not necessarily in ultimate goal. In Sitting Bull's case, the Mounties worked to persuade him to return to the U.S. while withholding adequate access to resources, including food. What Sitting Bull wanted, and what neither country was willing to provide, was, quote, the right to move in the open country, to live on this side of the line or the other, as I see fit, end quote. While Liddell goes to considerable lengths to show that perceptions of the U.S.-Canadian border at the 49th parallel between Montana and Alberta and Saskatchewan have varied more than the mythology allows, many 20th and 21st century writers have exploited those mythologies of difference for their own purposes. In his 1974 novel, Winter in the Blood, James Welch invokes the Medicine Line in ironic relation to its meaning for Chief Joseph and Sitting Bull. The airplane man, on the lam for an unnamed crime, tells the narrator only that he took something that didn't belong to him, the FBI is on his trail, and that he wants the narrator to drive him to Canada. Shouldn't you be in hiding? The narrator asks. I am, the airplane man answers. I'm hiding in Montana. What better place to hide? Except Canada, of course, and that's where you come in. From the airplane man's East Coast urban perspective, the Outback West is one sprawling hiding place, and this will come up again in Ford. But Canada and the Medicine Line offer a boundary U.S. authorities supposedly cannot cross. The narrator sees the border, unlike in Sitting Bull's day, as a place that offers no sanctuary, for the border control relentlessly harasses Indians. Meg Armstrong observes, do the airplane man and No Name catch the irony involved in the Indian driving the white man to Canada to escape pursuit by the federal government? Armstrong lets the matter drop following her rhetorical question, but while the airplane man might not have extensive command of 19th century Native American history, he understands the racism of border guards in the 1960s when the novel is set. And for readers, the resonance is stronger in the wake of the 1973 incidents at Wounded Knee and the AIM, American Indian Movement. The airplane man's border crossing strategy depends on the narrator drawing harassment by the agents there, allowing the white airplane man to pass freely along into Canada. The screenplay for the 2012 film adaptation emphasizes such racism when the airplane man expresses disappointment that as a, half-breed, Virgil First Rays, the name given the narrator for the film, might not look Indian enough for the harassment ploy to work. And if the border itself marks the narrator's racialized difference from the white airplane man, the narrator also understands that such border crossing is boundary crossing, and he thinks, quote, if I went through with it, I would become somebody else, and the girl would have no meaning for me, end quote. For the narrator, already lost to himself from trauma and his time as an exile in Seattle, his identity is place-based. He's one thing at home in Montana, but would be another thing entirely should he border cross. Just the contemplation of the trip, in the context of seeing his Cree not-quite wife on the streets of Harlem, Montana, is enough to spark a warmth in me that surprised me that I couldn't remember having felt in years, end quote. The possibility of traveling to Canada to serve as the outlaw's sidekick offers a slight shift in perspective that signals the beginning of the emotional thaw that represents the novel's climax, a thaw that grounds the narrator in his home place. The impossibility of sanctuary across the medicine line for 20th century Native people is further emphasized in Welch's second novel, The Death of Jim Loney, published in 1979. Welch imbues Loney's landscape with the ghosts of origin stories and Native histories. Loney, an alcoholic again, out of work, more or less orphaned and isolated, goes on a deer hunting trip with his estranged high school friend, Albert Pretty Weasel. Their journey echoes Native stories about the places they call home, including the story of how the Bear Paw Mountains got their name. In that story, a deer hunter takes his kill down from the mountains and encounters a bear on the prairie, and it goes on, and the mountains are named Bear Paws. They're officially called the Bear's Paw, which no one says because it's awkward. From the novel, 30 miles north lay Canada. This is just after he's mistakenly shot his friend. It occurred to him that he had never been to Canada. Once in high school, they had scheduled a game with a Canadian town. They had joked all week about whether those Canucks knew what a basketball was, but they didn't get to make the trip. The road north out of Harlem had drifted shut. As Loney looked at the prairies, he thought of the name of that town, Val Marie. It sounded so foreign that he couldn't help wishing, even now, that they had made the trip. The narrator hears the brittle crashing of dry stalks. He sees a bear, and he shoots, and then discovers he's shot his friend Pretty Weasel. Stunned and cold, he starts to run away, quote, north toward what was called the Old Highway, looking up at the prairies that swelled towards Canada. He thought if he continued north, he would reach Val Marie. And again, I'm quoting, maybe it would take all night, maybe a week, but it was there, and the people were different. Their lives were good, and their farms were the biggest in the world, and who cared if they could play basketball? Then he thought, there are no Indians there, or even half-breeds, and he became frightened. He knew he was marked, that it was a matter of time, but for the moment, he had all the time in the world, and he settled down. Maybe he would make it to Val Marie someday. Those Canucks, they were different, end quote. Ultimately, Canada, with its history of imagined sanctuary for Indians, thinking of Sitting Bull and Chief Joseph, and its allure of difference remains unattainable for Loney, and by novel's end, he is retreated to Mission Canyon in the Little Rockies Mountains, a region marked by both the indigenous ghosts who populate his dreams and by references to colonization by whites, Mission Canyon. There, with no home place or fully realized workable identity, he commits suicide by cop. In both novels, Welch evokes the medicine line as a sanctuary while acknowledging that in the 20th century, the border both tantalizes with the possibility of difference, while difference itself, racially, is always already a kind of crime. The kinds of stereotypes about Canadian and American differences, ones that Beth Liddell works to undercut in the medicine line, come under scrutiny in Tom King's 1989 novel, Medicine River. While King plays national differences for laughs in multiple sections, among the most biting examples occurs through the character of David Plume. Years earlier, Plume had crossed the border from Canada into the US to join the American Indian movement, and he wears his time with AIM and Wounded Knee both proudly and literally in the form of an AIM logo jacket. Plume, like many of the characters in the book, feels marginalized and has been teased mercilessly about his ongoing pride in his criminal and activist endeavors. Canadians, too, it seems, buy into the myths of violent America. And when Ray Little Buffalo, one of David's staunchest critics, is injured, the local white-owned newspaper reports that David Plume has shot him. They report the story through the frame of violent, lawless Indians, no doubt influenced by American Native activism. Will Sampson, the protagonist of the novel, and others in Medicine River's First Nations community believe that story. But, of course, Plume has not shot Little Buffalo. Although angry over the threat of his jacket, Plume shoots at Little Buffalo, but Ray's injuries come from self-inflicted accident with a bottle, not from a gunshot wound. King also serves up several characters supposedly on the lam, but in each case, the truth is that these so-called outlaws are far less dangerous than the stories suggest, and the one murder in the novel is accepted quietly as an understandable and justifiable action, and that murder is labeled suicide so that the community can protect the justified murderer. In the world of King's Medicine River, no one fits the largely American-derived stereotype of the criminal, nor the stereotype of the Indian. Which leads me to Richard Ford's 2012 novel, Canada. Ford plays considerably with both the outlaw mystique and its consequences, and on each side of the border. Set in 2010, the novel recounts the story of Del Parsons in first-person narration. For most of the 420 pages, Del recalls events in 1960 that changed his life irrevocably. When Del and his twin sister, Berner, were 15 and living in Great Falls, Montana, his parents robbed a bank in North Dakota and set the family on a radically different course. Bev Parson, Del's father, is a nomadic, smooth-talking Southerner who lands in Great Falls while serving in the Air Force. His career stagnant and his marriage to Neva, according to Del, is in trouble. Like characters in Ford's early short stories and in the collection Rock Springs, Del's dad starts with small-time outlaw antics, selling black market beef rustled by some Cree Indians from north of Great Falls. They are serious and mean, and he owes them money. Like Welch's Airplane Man, Bev Parsons believes in Old West fantasies of a lawless frontier. Desperate, he thinks that as a white middle-class American, he can remain unobtrusive while robbing a small North Dakota bank. A serial mover, he understands nothing about Northern Plains cultures, and as Bonnie and Clyde Monkey, he and Neva stick out like sore thumbs and are easily apprehended. With their parents in jail, Del and his sister are left in Great Falls to fend for themselves. Berner takes off for the West Coast alone, leaving her less mature twin, Del, to fend for himself. At their mother's request, a family friend spirits Del off to Saskatchewan, one step ahead of social services. I think of Wes Anderson's Moonlight Kingdom here. At 15, Del, an innocent victim of his parents' destructive naivete, is on the lam, an exile in a foreign country. It's a second hasty and foolish plan. His coyote, Mildred, delivers him to a shady Métis who will, in turn, deliver Del to Mildred's brother, Arthur, himself on the lam in Canada. Years earlier, Arthur planted a bomb that resulted in death. In the States, Arthur had become a rabid anti-labor union activist when his academic career deflated. Note, disappointed academics do not try this. The bomb wasn't meant to kill, but it did, and Arthur fled from Michigan to a hotel in Saskatchewan owned by a political sympathizer. Arthur inherits the hotel and takes in truckers and Americans who come for the bird hunting. Del works as a kind of indentured servant for him, living in squalor under the supervision of the eccentric and somewhat dangerous Charlie Quarters, who is Métis. Throughout the novel, bisected by its own medicine line, Part 1 takes place in Montana, Part 2 in Canada. Del's plain and understated narration recounts two very different versions of a grim life for a teenage boy. Del wants to be an intellectual, and school has been his only sanctuary from life of dislocation and dysfunction. But as a fugitive, he can't attend school, can't interact with the locals, and has only crazy Charlie, distant and eccentric Arthur, and Arthur's paramour, Florence, to talk to. Florence, a Canadian, offers Dell a possibility of sanctuary in Winnipeg and school, suggesting he might go live a quiet, lawful Canadian life with her adult son there. She offers him a book on Canadian citizenship so that he might pass as Canadian. When a lethal threat comes to this cluster of fugitives, it comes not from the Mounties or the Canadian authorities, or even from curious townsfolk. It instead comes from the U.S., mirroring the recent deployment of U.S. Marshals into Canada and Mexico to apprehend U.S. fugitives from justice. Private investigators from the States arrived in Saskatchewan to find Arthur and determine his guilt in the bombing many years earlier. With the exception of Florence and Charlie, who's himself on the lam from some unstated and apparently unspeakable crime, all of the Canadians in this novel keep their distance with a kind of live and let live laissez-faire. Arthur takes matters into his own hands, murders the investigators from Michigan, and forces Dell to be an accomplice to his crime. In the aftermath, Florence manages to send Dell off to her son. Dell becomes a Canadian citizen, receives an education, marries, and we find him in the very short final section of the novel, late in a career as a high school English teacher, reflecting on his past and a last meeting in the U.S. with his estranged twin sister. She has changed her name from the exotic but awkward Burner, bestowed by her eccentric mother, to Beverly, her father's gender-crossing name, and she has lived her own outlaw life, an addict and a wanderer throughout the U.S. West. Dell reflects on national difference in these final pages. His Canadian students, quote, "who are 17 and 18 are generally amused by me. They tell me I talk like a Yank, even though I don't, and I tell them there's no difference. I tell them it's not hard to be a Canadian. Kenyans and Germans and Indians do it with ease. And I had so little training to be an American anyway. They want to know if I was a draft dodger long ago. I tell them I was a Canadian conscript, and Canada saved me from a fate worse than death, which they understand to mean America. Sometimes they jokingly ask me if I changed my name. I assure them I did not. Impersonation and deception, I tell them, are the great themes of American literature, but in Canada, not so much." Here, Ford works to erase difference. On the one hand, he sounds no different, looks no different from white Anglo-Canadians, while asserts difference in the world of representation, literary traditions in this case. These themes, however, are the great themes of white American literature, not Native literature. While Welch's Native characters have impersonated ordinary American citizens, the deception is deadly, and by each novel's end, his protagonists have rejected the deception and embraced some version of their indigeneity, And to do so, they must stop moving, home in, as Bill Beavis has called it. For them, the medicine line is both all too real and phantom. Winter in the Blood's narrator and Jim Loney each adopt a version of what Lewis Owens calls a warrior stance, embracing their place-based identities as they embrace connection to their indigenous relatives and ancestors. For Loney, the warrior stance empowers him to choose the time, place, and manner of his death. He chooses a place with deep associations for his indigenous relatives and in a place saturated with significance, a place where old stories vibrate with life and where Native people, unlike Ford's Dell, resist identification with national character. At the end of Welch's novels, readers see clearly which affiliation his characters have chosen, but in Ford's Canada, that's not as clear. Richard Ford's Dell tries desperately to blend in, seeking stability through education, stasis, but as his students note, he fails. Just as in the documentary The Invisible Border asserts, national differences are powerful. Dell might believe he knows who he is, but his students and Ford's readers are not so sure. At best, Dell has broken his family's nomadic streak. He has stayed put to the best of his ability. These novels bring us back to the conundrum of the medicine line with its magic and mythologies, and we are on the next section of Wallace Stegner's Pontoon Bridge, thinking about identity, place, and the power of the imaginary, and of that invisible and durable last line. Thank you. Thank you.